Hello, everyone. Welcome to McGill Cares, a weekly webcast series addressing a wide variety of topics to support family and informal caregivers. I'm Claire Webster, a former caregiver, certified Alzheimer care consultant, and founder of the McGill University Dementia Education Program. These webcasts are made possible thanks to the generosity of our donors and sponsors. Today's webcast is brought to you by Home Care Assistance. Home Care Assistance provides older adults with quality care that enables them to live happier, healthier lives at home. Their services are distinguished by the caliber of their caregivers, the responsiveness of their staff, and their expertise in cognitive care. Today's topic is navigating stress and loss when caring for a loved one with dementia. It's something that is incredibly close to my heart and is really the essence of everything that I have committed to do throughout the past many years. My guest is Dr. Tamara Sussman, Associate Professor at the McGill School of Social Work. For over 10 years, she has worked with adults and families to manage health-related issues in both hospital and community settings. Dr. Sussman's research focuses on how health services and systems impact older adults and their family members. Welcome, Dr. Sussman.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm just so happy that we can discuss this topic because there's nothing more important to me than really caring for the caregiver. And although the focus and the title is on caring for a loved one with dementia, everything that we're going to be talking about today is really pertinent to any caregiver. So you really got my attention as a result of an article that you published in the Montreal Gazette on May 19th, entitled Seniors Caring for Seniors, Are Pandemic's Invisible Victims. So it was yourself and Shari Brotman, both of you associate professors at McGill, who wrote this. And basically what you said was, senior caregivers are among the essential frontline workers struggling on a daily basis to keep our healthcare system afloat while putting themselves at risk in the process. Can you talk about what motivated you to write this article?
Sure. So we were all quite well informed about what was going on in long-term care. As soon as the pandemic came up, the numbers were striking. For some, the atrocities were things they'd heard for the first time. And while undoubtedly we felt that a wake up in long-term care was required, we felt that there was a lot of silence around all of the unspoken and invisible care that's happening in the community as well. The truth is that 4% of individuals end up in a long-term care home who are older. So the vast majority are cared for in the community and cared for by family members. And it felt like things like should families visit or not, those weren't choices when you were caring for somebody at home in the community. You were there exposing yourself potentially to a COVID positive individual while providing care to them. So we felt that the conversation needed to be more broad.
Mm-hmm. And how has the pandemic really opened up Pandora's box really with regards to, because there was so much focus on the long-term care, but really now, how has the pandemic really opened up the reality of people caring for people at home? And how has the pandemic impacted this reality for them?
I think, in terms of if you were supporting somebody at home, all of a sudden, any service, and they're already minimal to begin with, that you were relying on, whether it was someone coming into your home or maybe taking somebody to a day program to give you a little bit of relief, was shut down immediately without further ado, without any opportunity to plan. So while you're already exhausted with the care you might have been providing directly, you had to take on more care as a consequence of all of those shutdowns. Mm-hmm. Of course, we know the challenges that families faced when their loved one was in long-term care. In a day, they were told they weren't allowed to visit and offer the care that they had been providing and that allowed them to stay connected. So that was a huge thing. Also, you're now responsible not only to manage the social distancing and the precautions for yourself, but for somebody else who may not understand that they're supposed to be wearing a mask, or why so-and-so isn't coming, or why you can't go outside. So whatever you were doing before just got heightened, needing to constantly explain, no, we can't go to the day program today. No, we can't go for a walk right now and see so-and-so, it's not safe. That was a huge burden. And of course, in addition to this loss and the grief that you're going through as a caregiver on a daily basis by seeing deterioration right in front of you and anticipating what's to come, the world is grieving from a complete change. So you are managing, you're holding so much together as a consequence of this added burden from the pandemic.
So we're going to take, I would like to really provide a really thorough picture as much as we can in the time that we have about, navigating stress and loss, but also just to begin and back up and say that many family members don't recognize or identify themselves as caregivers. This
Right.
is simply a role that they're to take. Like I never saw myself as a caregiver. I saw myself as a daughter caring for a mother, right?
Right.
So can you describe the various, what I could call the job description that define a caregiver?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, Claire, because I think that what sometimes tips the scale for a caregiver is when they start taking on tangible tasks they didn't normally do in their role. So if you're now buying groceries for your mom because she's no longer able to manage that, you're starting to feel like a caregiver. But that's the visible stuff. The other stuff caregivers do, anticipate what's coming down the pipeline in terms of loss, in terms of decisions that need to be made, coordinating all of the care, trying to figure out who's coming in to help, which doctor's appointment are we going to next, and actually facilitating that. Managing and anticipating the loss and the grief, and is it the time now that I should be actually getting home care, even if my relative doesn't want it? Is that what I should be doing? So all of these heavy decisions and problem solving that you're doing on behalf of somebody else really, really adds a stress and burden to the experience. And I don't think caregivers even realize what a day in the life of what they do regularly involves. There was some really interesting research that I had read around that case management piece, the coordination of care, actually really adds to the burden. You don't even realize that you're just, not only are you managing your own life, not only are you maybe managing the life of your own family and kids if you're an adult caregiver, you're now managing the life of somebody else who used to manage on their own. It's a lot of responsibility, emotionally and physically.
I also find like when I work with families who are caring for loved ones with dementia, the evolution of the disease gets to a point where all of a sudden the family member is doing all of, like you say, all the physical work, like you're dressing somebody, you're feeding somebody, you're the reality is you're changing diapers when you're, and you're doing all these tasks that all of a sudden you wake up and go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that the evolution,
How it
that
came to this.
nobody prepared me for this, right?
Right, right. And you're also, especially at that stage, you're the transmitter of the person to other people.
Mhm.
You're the one who tells the caregiver, if you want to give my parent a bath, it really helps when you play this music or when you give them this food beforehand. So you're actually the holder of their personhood in a way, and helping the world see that, even when sometimes you lose sight of it yourself, which is a huge emotional contribution, but also burden.
Mhm. So I would like to talk about now the impact of caregiving and really on the emotions. So, when we teach our classes at McGill, I like to use a slide that says, you are not alone.
Right.
Because I will never forget the day that, my mother received her diagnosis and I was sitting in that doctor's office, and what I call like the shock factor. Like here you receive a diagnosis of something that is going to change the person's life forever, but is also going to change my life forever.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're thrown into this whirlwind or cyclone of emotion that I was dealing with over multiple years, but I felt so many emotions, but then I also felt guilty, or I felt angry, but I also felt shame because I'm thinking, how dare I feel this way, and nobody else could be the way I am. So can you take us through that journey of emotions that we go
Sure.
through?
I mean, I think you touched on so many of them. There's the sadness and the loss, not just for what you've lost, but for what the person you love is lost and is going to lose. And the anticipation of that is so heavy, the yearning for what was. there's the anger and the frustration. Why did this happen? And not just that, as you're starting to have to take on things like, how can I manage all of this? And where are the services that I thought existed? And why aren't my friends calling anymore, or my relatives' friends calling anymore? That, of course, leads also to feeling really isolated. Everything seems to be unchanged for everybody else, and my world has collapsed. Stress and worry, which we already talked about. What's going to happen? What decisions am I going to make? What's going to happen if I get sick? However am I going to do things if my relative can no longer drive, for example? Like every loss, you're just worried about the next one coming down the pipeline. And I think you touched on that guilt. You're constantly in a state of guilt because you can't possibly be everywhere for everybody. So whether it's, I'm guilty because I'm not doing a good enough job at work because I'm spending too much time with my family, or I'm guilty because I'm not spending much time with my kids because I'm caring for my mother, or I'm guilty because I'm doing too good a job at home and I'm not caring enough for my mother. There's just a myriad of things to feel guilty about because there simply isn't enough in you and enough support to do everything that you are faced with as a caregiver in this circumstance.
So the biggest emotion that I was really coping with was anger. Okay. Yeah. So can you touch upon anger and how powerful anger can be?
I mean, anger is the emotion that we don't like to admit to having. Somehow, it doesn't sound very compassionate to be angry, but anger in and of itself, with the fact that caregivers actually are often alone caring for the bulk of the care with very limited support, is natural. The disappointment that you start to experience as a caregiver in what is and isn't available and how much is actually on the plate of a family member's. And, some suggest that anger is also kind of a component of grief and a component of sadness, that anger kind of keeps you going and keeps you moving. But underlying that anger, if you really allowed yourself to sit with it, there is also this incredible raw sadness around, why is the person that I knew to be X and Y going through this? So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that caregivers particularly feel so guilty about the anger, and that they're always supposed to be patient, and that they're always supposed to be compassionate. Well, how many times a day do we all, communicate in a way that we aren't very proud of in our own lives with our own kids? That's the reality of having a lot on your plate. So I think anger is a huge...
And it's terrible because you feel angry, but then you feel guilty for feeling angry. And then how you manage the anger through certain coping mechanisms, it makes you end up feeling shame.
Right.
So you're going in this cycle of anger, guilt, shame. Let's start over. Anger, guilt, shame over and over again. And it really can, like in my case, it almost destroyed me as a person. I mean, it led to my burnout, but it's an incredibly vicious cycle.
Yeah.
So can you talk about best strategies to manage these emotions? Like what would be the best strategies?
I mean, in the time, especially now of COVID, where where there are limited supports, it's more important than ever to stay connected. Staying connected means, having a Zoom call with a person who you really feel a connection with, and actually speaking about what you're feeling, not just what you did today. Staying connected yourself with your own emotions and giving yourself time and honoring the feelings that you're having, and to the best of your abilities, also staying connected with the person who you're providing support for and caring. When you get no joy out of caregiving, it can be even more distressing. So even little moments where you feel like you had a great interaction can actually be quite uplifting for caregivers. So trying to the best of your abilities to stay connected. Planning ahead is a huge issue. Caregivers are always planning ahead in some ways around thinking about when I might have to make the decision that I can no longer do this anymore, or when might I have to make the decision as the illness progresses around certain medical things that I may or may not want to have happen. But now caregivers actually have to also plan, what happens if I get sick in a heartbeat from COVID, or what happens if my person who I'm caring for gets sick and gets put into the hospital and I can't visit. So contingency planning, who is your backup? Do you have a bag pack for the hospital? Do you have your care plan kind of written out in case somebody else needs to take over in a minute? That can be really helpful. But self-care is also critical. And self-care can feel very burdensome. It's like, one more thing I got to do now. I got to take care of myself. If you don't take care of yourself, you can't support somebody else. So you might just need that half an hour in the morning without any disturbance, even if you have to lock yourself in the bathroom for it, for a peaceful cup of coffee. Exercising if you can, keeping up with a routine, eating well, those kinds of things actually do make a difference in terms of allowing yourself to journey for the long haul.
Why do caregivers have such a hard time giving themselves permission to have some time for themselves?
Yeah. You know what? I think part of it, honestly, is us as a society. We give caregivers mixed messages. We say, take care of yourself. Oh, but by the way, home care can only come tomorrow. I mean, how, so you can't help me, but I still need to take care of myself at the sacrifice now, potentially, of the person who I'm caring for. So honestly, some of it, I think, is built into our system. We don't have a very strong network of support for caregivers that places them in the position where they have to feel selfish to self-care. We don't enable it as much. I think that's a huge problem. And I really hope that as we kind of question so many things that are getting exposed through COVID, that we can start asking ourselves how to be more compassionate, how to make these things more visible, how to offer one another different forms of support. Because it's very frustrating for a caregiver to be told, you should be doing yoga, you should be eating well, and then to be told, I'm sorry, you have half an hour that we can give you for a bath, even though your relative needs 7 hours of care every day. And you have to work, and you have kids to take care of.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of your strategies is information, because I believe in being as educated as possible on the disease and make sure you understand. But what you just said about, for instance, getting the support, I find one of our biggest challenges is the majority of people have no idea how to access support from the public system, right? Because they're not, when they're being given the diagnosis, let alone they're not being given the information about the disease, but then they're not being told, okay, make sure to contact the CLSC, get an assessment. So where can they go for information about what's available to them?
Yeah, I think, well, we do have, now an 811 number, right, in Quebec that is supposed to offer kind of information about psychosocial support and hopefully give you the kind of right CLSC or CUs to call, because sometimes, you can call 7 times before you reach the person you're supposed to, which is exhausting. I think people aren't connected early enough to places like the Alzheimer Society and Alzheimer's Group, Inc., which are 2 organizations that are more community-based, that are there to travel with caregivers from the beginning and offer a lot of psychosocial support and interesting kind of programming. And the earlier you can enact the planning ahead, I think that's what's really helpful about doing this early. You could start anticipating things and kind of get ahead of the game rather than always being in crisis mode.
Well, go ahead, sorry.
But I am the first to say that we all think a home care system exists, and it does, but it doesn't. If you don't have the financial resources to get a little bit of additional help for yourself, you're going to find very limited supports in our home care system right now, which is something I think we all need to call the government on and to call attention to.
I think that your point about planning ahead, that is probably one of the biggest pieces of advice that I share with families, that you need to always be, especially with dementia, you have to be one step ahead of the disease at all times. So if your loved one is in a certain stage, you want to be at the next stage. You
Right.
want to always be prepared. What's coming? What's next? And then when they get to that next stage, you want to be again, what's ahead? What's coming? Instead of always being in crisis mode or just, in defense mode, right?
Yeah.
And because of COVID, I also feel like you had mentioned that, if you have plan A, so plan A is now your home and you have a little bit of help, well, you need plan B, because if something happens to the family caregiver or they don't have family around them, if something were to change, what's plan B? There must always be a plan B. And I think that's the hard part for caregivers to get to, is like, oh, we're not ready yet. We're going to wait. We're still okay. Like I always hear that, we're still okay.
Right.
No, you have to be prepared.
Yeah,
Right?
and there is pretty solid evidence to suggest that when you make decisions in a crisis, you usually feel less satisfied and more distressed. When you make decisions that you had been reflecting upon for a while, you tend to feel less burdened and a
Mm-hmm.
little bit more
Mm-hmm.
relieved, which
Mm-hmm.
is to that point.
Yeah.
Even if what you thought you were going to do isn't what you ended up doing because the circumstances completely changed,
Mm-hmm.
having thought through contingencies
Mm-hmm.
helps you implement a decision that you feel good about in the moment.
Like I can't emphasize more the importance of education and knowledge.
Yeah.
Like to become as educated as possible, understand the disease for which you're dealing with, thoroughly understand what's going on. Because unfortunately, again, with when we speak of dementia or I think other mental illnesses, you know, the healthcare community doesn't necessarily give us a prescription of care, tell us what we need to know. So we have to go and get it. And knowledge is power. And like you say, it may not make, the journey will still be difficult and challenging, but if we have the right tools and we know what to expect, we will be better prepared, right?
Right.
Than just grasping at straws and, not knowing where to go. So
Yeah.
knowledge is important.
Yeah, and people have the natural ability to kind of dose themselves.
Mhm.
Okay, I don't want to read this right now.
Yeah.
I'll read it later. So even just knowing something's there, you may choose because you are dealing with the loss and the anticipation. It's very emotionally
Mhm.
draining to think about. I think of this knowledge and information also as an iterative, ongoing process where you hear it differently once you're in the situation, right?
Mhm.
So I think that knowing where to go, reading what you can, but not just once, kind of over and over again as you start to really understand things is incredibly helpful. And I agree, knowledge is power.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask an important question, which I get asked a lot, is about self-monitoring.
Yeah.
Okay, what are the signs and symptoms that people should look for in terms of perhaps being on the brink of having a nervous breakdown?
Yeah. So, there's certainly a difference between being sad and being clinically depressed or being stressed and worried and being really burnt out,
Mhm.
which I'm sure you know well, having lived it yourself. But if your irritability level is a lot higher than usual and your regular strategies and even the new strategies people are trying to give you aren't working, if you're feeling chronically kind of exhausted and lethargic and unmotivated, a sense of hopelessness and helplessness, not just here and there or even relatively frequently, but kind of over time, all the time, that doesn't seem to dissipate during the course of the day, and an intense feeling of meaningless and purposefulness. Those kinds of things can really be triggers for getting a little bit of help. And I say that while also saying that it's incredibly normal to feel all those things.
Mhm.
So you are your best judge of whether this is a little more than usual and nothing you're doing within your normal network is helping.
Mhm.
And that's the time, whether it's, reaching out to your family doctor just to sort of see if there is an underlying depression or something that can be treated and helped. Or maybe you do actually need to leave from work for a period of time because it's all too much. Um, it's really important to check in with yourself and be on top of yourself, be on
And,
top.
there's a lot of consequences of not seeking help. I mean, I had sensed in myself probably a year and a half before the breakdown or burnout came that you know in your heart that something's happening. But, what I didn't realize at the time was that it was my behavior, my anger, my unraveling was really, especially among the sandwich generation, was having a ripple effect on my children. I was drinking more anger, and I never really realized that they were watching me, right?
Yeah.
So I, unfortunately, I didn't, like, the consequences of my behavior were having an impact on them. So do you see a correlation? Because I do. I mean, in your practice, you see a correlation between, the coping mechanisms, like, and addictions now. Like, there's been an increase in drinking and smoking, and maybe cannabis. Or do you see a correlation between coping
Yeah, I
mechanisms?
mean, like once again, it's not unusual to have a drink to calm your nerves. Many people do, you're feeling sad and you're feeling hopeless, and you want to buy yourself a new dress because that makes you feel better. But those things are very in the moment, and when they dissipate, when the effect of them dissipate, actually, if you're really trying to mask anxiety or depression, it typically gets worse after.
Mhm.
So if you are noticing that you're really using drugs and alcohol, shopping, gambling as an escape to the point where you really have to do it or you're going to lose it. And then the flip side is, and then it also starts to interfere with your sleep, and there's a coming down part of it where then you're more depressed than when you started. That's when you once again need to ask yourself, am I relying on this too much as a
Mhm.
mask for
Mhm.
some of the things that I am experiencing?
And I think what I learned from my own experience is that all these coping mechanisms that I was using, I thought once my caregiving years were over, like after my mom passed away in 2016, I thought, okay, I'll deal with it then, I'll be better. But what I didn't realize is that those habits that had followed me for over 12 years, they didn't disappear, like, at all. They were still there. I didn't deal with the grief, I didn't deal with the trauma. And so I was using those coping mechanisms. And now, even though that was 4 years ago, she passed away. And now my journey in the last 6 months is now I'm dealing with it. But it didn't go away, which I think a lot of people, I hear friends of mine sometimes say,
Right.
okay, once it's over, I'll be fine.
Right.
But
Right.
it's
Well,
not fine,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I really appreciate you raising it, because it's not black and white. Just because you're experiencing a burnout doesn't mean A, that there aren't good reasons for it, and B, that you can't heal from it, right? It's not that you've crossed that line never to come back. So the more you wake up and identify when things have seeped into your life that aren't helpful for you, the easier, and accept it without feeling ashamed and without feeling guilty, it's easier to turn things around and seek help. And that's, unfortunately, especially with things like drinking, um, and drugs, people are embarrassed to
Mhm,
suggest
mhm,
that this could end up being something that they're using as a crutch.
mhm,
So we need to be more open and compassionate with one another around, well, you know what? Of course, you're doing everything you can just to stay together. Is it helping you?
mhm.
Is another question. Not you're a bad person for having turned to that, but how is it really helping you with some of the emotions that you're feeling?
I think to share with people, like, a personal story was, when my mother was in and out of hospitals and dealing with her dementia. And at the time, my kids were so young. So I'd spend all day at whatever hospital or rehabilitation center she was. My friends would offer to pick up my kids from school. I'd be, no, no, I'm all good. I can do it. Walking through the door with the girls who were really young at the time. It was like 4:30, 5 o'clock, and they'd be, Mommy, we have homework, need homework. And it was like, oh my God, sorry, can't do it. Just let me be. Go to the fridge, grab the bottle of wine. Like, by 6:30, the first bottle was finished. And then just, like, so angry all the time. And no matter how many glasses I drank, it didn't make me feel better. But what would happen is I would wake up the next morning feeling terrible shame, and
Mhm.
then saying, okay, I'm not doing this again. But guess what? I did it again.
Right.
And, and I wish I would have realize the impact that it had on the girls. You know, I'm fortunate today because I talk about it with them. They see what I'm doing, the webcast, but you know, it was so hard, and I wish I would have reached out for help. I really do. I really wish I would have reached out for help.
Yeah.
You know,
But,
so
I think we also have to remember that they see both things. They might have seen the drinking, but they also see the care and compassion that you gave to your mom, which they also learned. So, caregivers somehow feel they need to be the perfect warrior, right? To do everything perfectly. Just caring, just trying to do well is such a great message, both to the person that you're trying to support and to the other people around you who are learning from you. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but if the intention is, around care and about love and about compassion, that's what people also see.
Can you talk about also like the impact of grief? We talk about anticipatory grief with dementia or other illnesses that progress the way dementia does. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, grief is an emotion that is almost hard to put words on if you haven't felt it. It can be like a pit of your stomach, draining, yearning, sadness, longing for something that was, and helplessness for what could be coming next. It's a very heavy, emotionally loaded feeling. And caregivers are now carrying that grief and also inundated by the world grieving, right? So it may even be more exacerbated. But with grief also does come the opportunity for personal growth.
I love that. You said that I love that.
Yeah. So if you do allow yourself to ground in that feeling sometimes, to really feel, what is it that I am feeling right now? What am I thinking? Allow yourself to navigate through that emotion. That is the first step towards saying, okay, what do I need to do and enact in myself to feel a little better? And that's really the strategy towards what can also be personal growth and change.
And it takes time to come to that realization. I mean, when I realized that what was this journey? Why was I put in this situation? Why was she put in this situation? I mean, I look at it today to say the gift of my mother's illness is the resilience that I learned. I kind of feel like I was on this training ground, and it was preparing me to be able to do the work that I do today. But at the time, I would have never imagined it, but it did. I said that I could not have gone through all those years, not only with her, but other experiences that I had lived, that it was all for nothing. But why? And so I think when you can see it as an opportunity to grow as a person, it's quite incredible.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, so when we talk about people reaching out for support, today people are afraid. They're afraid to leave home. They're afraid to go to the doctor. Doctors are much more difficult to get a hold of. People are afraid to go to the hospital. So how could people get help for themselves? Like, I mean, what's available to them? I mean, there is a lot of good resources like what we're doing with McGill Cares, but how else can people get help for themselves?
I mean, again, I think calling the 811 number, they're really supposed to be there to say what the psychosocial supports and helps are that are still running. Places like the Alzheimer Society and Alzheimer's Group Inc. for the Anglophone community, your local CLSC, CUS, they're all still running. And even if you're not feeling comfortable, let's say having somebody come into your home, you're not sure that that's a safe thing, you can certainly get phone support, advice, and help with problem solving. And to that point, though, Claire, I think this is where the information does come in. You can, before you decide whether you shouldn't or should have home care come in, you can find out how to make it safer. What are the safe practices? What are the caregivers who are coming in doing? You can certainly ask them. They're probably all mandated to do so by now. Wearing a mask. If you see somebody didn't wash their hands, this is your home. Tell them to wash your hands. You could even do a screening test at the door, just like people are doing in hospital. Have you traveled outside of the country for the last 14 days? Do you have a temperature? I don't know if you've seen those temperature thermometers where you can just touch the forehead. I mean, this is your right to do all of these things if you've got somebody coming into the home, and you want somebody coming into the home, but you want it to happen safely.
So what would be some last pieces of advice that you'd like to share? Like, what would be like if somebody was starting, let's say somebody who's starting the journey as a caregiver to someone with dementia, or, what would be your top pieces of advice?
I think the main thing is don't let yourself feel and be alone. Let yourself be seen. Reach out, even if it's at first to a friend, to truly connect. It is so easy to feel alone and isolated in this journey that you're journeying, but there are so many people around who can truly relate to what it is that you're going to on a very personal level. And I think that staying connected, even more so now in the context that we're in, where those natural places where we just had little chats with people are kind of gone, don't let yourself be invisible. Make yourself visible and you will be seen.
This has been just so, I've been trying to stay not emotionally. There were many times I was feeling very teary. And I think I would like to add to everything that you've said and just really educate yourself, understand the disease, and reinforce what you just said. Please plan one step ahead, be ahead. Always one step ahead is the way to go. Tamara, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. I'm so grateful to be able to have done this webcast, and I really hope for everybody watching to please share this webcast with others who are going through the same journey. It's so important to talk about it, and I also think that to be vulnerable, just to say, hey, I'm not doing okay, I need help, like just be vulnerable. Wearing that mask doesn't work. Trying to be that superwoman or everything's okay when it's really not okay, it doesn't work. So next week, our webcast will be on nurses advocating as end-of-life caregivers. It's going to be very interesting. 2 nurses sharing their personal stories of caring for loved ones with dementia and suffering loss as well during this COVID crisis. Our guest will be Louise Murray, Director of the Clinical Partnerships Office, and Catherine Ann Miller, Faculty Lecturer, both from the Ingram School of Nursing of McGill University. And just to remind everyone that this webcast is an initiative of the McGill Dementia Education Program, which is funded by private donations. Once again, I'd like to thank Home Care Assistance to make this webcast possible today. If you would like to contribute or make a donation, please visit us at www.mcgill.ca/dementia. And you can write to us with any questions or topics that you would like to recommend at dementia@mcgill.ca. So until next week, take good care of yourselves and of your loved ones. Thank you for watching.